This is the brief on the Philippines Chemical Weapons Prohibition Act. Passed in April 2025, Republic Act number 12174 isn't just a bureaucratic update. It's a literal zero-tolerance shield designed to protect human life and the global environment from catastrophic harm. So let's dive into exactly how this uncompromising defense mechanism actually works. First, we're looking at an absolute ban on developing, producing, stockpiling, or using chemical weapons. They've tapped the Anti-Terrorism Council, partnering them with the international OPCW watchdog. The ATC is now the nation's supreme chemical border patrol, tracking everything from raw lab precursors right down to the final destruction of toxins. Now, if you're going to create a ban this absolute, well, you need equally absolute consequences to enforce it. Second, the penalties are crushing. You might think you have to be some rogue scientist to get locked up, right? No way. Simply financing these operations gets you 20 years to life. Creating or using them, that means life without parole and up to a 5 million peso fine. Even negligent corporate directors who look the other way face criminal liability and permanent revocation of their business licenses. So the law is ironclad at own, and the penalties are devastating. But what happens if a citizen goes overseas, or if these weapons are actually found? Finally, this law has global reach, applying to Filipino citizens, corporations, or ships literally anywhere in the world. Plus, getting rid of a chemical weapon can be just as dangerous as storing it, right? Seized weapons must be destroyed under strict environmental protocols, so absolutely no open-pit burning or ocean dumping. Ultimately, the Philippines has effectively locked down its citizens, corporations, and environment against the threat of chemical warfare with a policy of absolute zero tolerance.
A really big piece of legislation just hit the books in the Philippines. It's called the Chemical Weapons Prohibition Act. And honestly, it's going to completely reshape how the country deals with some of the most dangerous substances on Earth. So let's dive in and break down what this is all about and why it's so important.
So what's the big deal with this law, and why now? This is a major move, not just for the Philippines itself, but for how it's seen on the world stage. We're going to get into exactly what's now illegal, who's in charge of making sure the rules are followed, and the real reason this act was put into place.
Okay, first things first, let's get right into the nuts and bolts of what this law actually prohibits. And this isn't some vague statement either. It's a super detailed list of rules that are really the heart of this entire law.
The law is incredibly specific when it defines a chemical weapon. It's not just the poison itself. You have to think of it as a three-part system. First, you have the toxic chemical. Second, you have the munition, the shell or device built to deliver it. And third, you have the special equipment you'd need to use it. All three of those pieces make up the whole weapon.
So starting with that definition, the law lays out this whole list of banned activities. And as you can see, it covers the entire life cycle of a weapon, from coming up with the idea and funding it, all the way to actually using it. What's really interesting is that it even bans using things like tear gas, a riot control agent, as a weapon of war. The bottom line here is that any kind of involvement, whether you're hands-on or just helping out, is now a very serious crime.
But wait, does this mean every dangerous chemical is now illegal? No, not at all. And this is a really important point. The law makes a clear distinction. If a chemical is being used for peaceful stuff, in factories, for medicine, or in a lab, it's totally fine. It all comes down to intent. The law is focused on stopping people from using these things as weapons.
So why this law and why right now? Well, this didn't just come out of nowhere. This is really about the Philippines making good on a huge promise it made to the rest of the world. And you don't have to take my word for it. It's spelled out right here in the law itself. This act directly links Philippine domestic law to the Chemical Weapons Convention. That's a massive global treaty overseen by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or the OPCW. So what the Philippines is doing here is taking its international commitment and turning it into a real, enforceable law at home.
We all know a law is only as good as the people who enforce it. So that begs the question, who exactly is the watchdog here? Who's in charge of making sure everybody follows these new rules?
Well, that huge responsibility now falls to an agency that's already in place, the Anti-Terrorism Council, or ATC. This new law officially makes the ATC the country's main authority on everything related to the Chemical Weapons Convention. They're now the go-to point of contact for the entire international community, and they've got a lot on their plate. Yeah, the ATC's job is a big one. They're not just a name on a piece of paper. They're in charge of writing the detailed regulations, leading inspections of facilities, launching investigations if something goes wrong, and handling all the communication with their international partners. They're basically the engine that's going to make this whole thing work.
And what happens if someone actually breaks this law? Well, the consequences are, let's just say they're incredibly serious. This law has some real teeth and is designed to make anyone think twice.
Just take a look at these penalties. If you're caught developing or using a chemical weapon, you're facing life in prison with no possibility of parole. But look, even just financing these activities could get you a life sentence. And misusing what they call Schedule 1 chemicals, those are the most dangerous ones with basically no legal use, that's up to 20 years. Even getting in the way of an inspector comes with a hefty prison term.
And the law gets even stricter for government officials. Any public servant found guilty of these crimes gets the absolute maximum penalty. Plus, they are banned from ever holding public office again for life. That sends a really powerful message about accountability. So what if authorities actually find and seize these weapons? Well, there's a very clear step-by-step process. First, everything is meticulously cataloged and photographed. Then, the armed forces takes control for secure storage and testing. After that, the weapons are legally forfeited to the government. And the final step? A court orders their complete and safe destruction, a process that can even be watched by international partners to ensure it's done right. All right, let's zoom out and put all these pieces together. Why does this single law matter so much, not just for the Philippines, but for the rest of the world too?
At the end of the day, this law does a few really crucial things all at once. It makes good on an important international promise. It builds a strong legal wall to stop these weapons from spreading. It puts a specific group, the ATC, in charge of enforcement, and it backs them up with incredibly tough penalties. But at its very core, this is all about protecting people and the planet from some of the worst weapons ever invented. The law is officially on the books, but its real story is just beginning. How it's implemented is everything. And that leaves us with one final and really important question to think about. How will this new law actually shape the future of safety, security, and global teamwork for the Philippines?
Imagine you are running a completely legal, highly profitable ink manufacturing plant.
Right.
Just somewhere in the industrial outskirts of Manila. You have hundreds of employees, a sprawling campus, and this massive supply chain.
A totally standard business.
Exactly. But then tomorrow morning, an international team of inspectors just shows up, unannounced.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they are flanked by armed representatives from the Anti-Terrorism Council. And the thing is, they aren't there to look at your ink.
No, definitely not.
They demand to test the wastewater flowing out of your treatment facility at the very back of the property. And they want to see your HR purchase orders.
Which sounds incredibly invasive.
It is, because if they find the wrong molecules, or even just the paperwork suggesting you bought the wrong molecules, your company is permanently dissolved.
Gone, just like that.
Gone. And you're going to prison for the rest of your natural life without the possibility of parole. So today, we are looking at the invisible, microscopic tripwires that govern the world's most dangerous substances.
It really is the absolute definition of regulating the invisible. I mean, you are no longer just policing what people do, right? You are policing the very building blocks of matter that they possess.
Right.
And more importantly, the intent behind possessing them.
And that is the journey we are taking you on today. Whether you are prepping for a high-level security briefing or catching up on the evolution of international law, or, you are just sitting there with an intense, burning curiosity about how a government actually polices molecules.
Which is a fascinating thing to be curious about.
It really is. So you are in the exact right place. We are diving deep into the source material of Republic Act number Honorable 174.
Right.
This is officially known as the Chemical Weapons Prohibition Act of the Philippines, enacted on April 15th, 2025.
And the mission of this deep dive today is to really dissect the anatomical structure of a nation's absolute ban on chemical warfare. We aren't just going to list off legal statutes.
No, that would be incredibly boring.
Exactly. We are going to explore the fundamental mechanics of how a government legally defines a chemical weapon in the first place.
Which is harder than it sounds.
Much harder. And we'll get into the massive interagency infrastructure required to police it, the frankly draconian penalties for violators, and the intense logistical nightmare of destroying these weapons safely once they are actually found.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because reading through this legislative text, I mean, it feels less like a standard legal document and more like a highly technical blueprint for a sci-fi thriller.
It does read a bit like a movie script sometimes.
Yeah. We're dealing with lethal chemicals, extraterritorial jurisdiction that literally follows citizens across the globe, international espionage prevention, and life imprisonment.
All very real, very serious things.
But to understand any of that, we have to start with the foundational premise of the entire document, the absolute declaration.
Right. So the state's policy declaration really sets the tone for everything that follows in the document. It mandates a policy of total unequivocal freedom from chemical weapons within its territory. And it frames this not just as like a national security issue, but as a binding mandate to protect human life and the global environment.
So it's a very broad, sweeping commitment.
Yes. And crucially, it grounds this entire legislative architecture in the Philippines' obligations under the Global Chemical Weapons Convention.
Often referred to as the CWC, right?
Exactly, the CWC. The state is formally declaring to the international community that under no circumstance will it develop, produce, manufacture, acquire, possess, stockpile, retain, or use chemical weapons.
Wow. So it is an absolute zero tolerance policy.
Total zero tolerance.
But, I mean, stating a zero tolerance policy immediately brings up the hardest part of this entire endeavor.
Yeah.
How do you actually define a chemical weapon?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because we aren't just talking about, a cartoon bomb with a skull and crossbones painted on the side. The law goes into microscopic detail to define the threat.
Well, it has to be microscopic. I mean, if the definition is even slightly vague, a well-funded bad actor, like a hostile state or a terrorist organization, they will find a loophole.
Right. They have the resources to exploit any gray area.
Exactly. So the text defines a chemical weapon as one or a combination of three distinct categories.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first category is the toxic chemicals themselves and their precursors, and we will definitely spend a lot of time on that one today.
Oh yeah, we have a lot to say about precursors.
Right. Now, the second category focuses on the munitions and devices specifically designed to cause death or other harm through the toxic properties of those chemicals.
Wait, let me pause and process that second category.
Yeah.
The text is saying that the empty shell of a bomb, if it is designed specifically to carry a toxic payload, that empty piece of metal is legally classified as a chemical weapon itself.
That is the legal reality, yeah.
Even without a single drop of poison inside it.
Even if it's completely clean. If an engineering team builds a missile warhead or an artillery shell whose sole engineered purpose is to disperse a toxic nerve agent upon impact, that warhead is a chemical weapon under this act.
Wow. So the intent is basically baked into the hardware.
Exactly. And the third category goes even further up the supply chain.
Other than the bombshell.
Yeah. It bans any equipment specifically designed to be used directly in connection with the employment of those munitions and devices.
So like the launch system itself.
Yeah. Yes.
Or a specialized sprayer attached to a drone. Mm-hmm. If it only exists to deliver a chemical payload, it is treated as the poison itself.
You've got it. The infrastructure of delivery is criminalized right alongside the chemical. But let's go back to that first category because that is where the chemistry really matters.
And where the policing becomes incredibly complex, I imagine.
Incredibly complex. It bans toxic chemicals and their precursors. So to understand this, we really have to define what a precursor actually is in the eyes of international law.
Right, so the law defines a precursor as a chemical reactant, which takes part at any stage in the production, by whatever method, of a toxic chemical.
Any stage, that's a key phrase.
And it even includes key components of binary or multi-component chemical systems. And as I was reading, it frequently references these things called scheduled chemicals in Schedules 1, 2, and 3 of the Convention's Annex.
Which are the big lists, basically.
The big list, yeah.
Yeah.
But here's the massive caveat that caught my attention. It bans these precursors, except when intended for, quote, purposes not prohibited under the convention, provided the type and quantity are consistent with peaceful purposes.
That caveat right there is the tightrope the entire global chemical industry walks every single day.
How so?
Well, to understand why, we need to demystify those schedules you mentioned. The global policing of chemicals isn't just a flat black and white list. It is a tiered risk assessment.
Okay.
So Schedule 1 chemicals are the worst of the worst. These are chemicals that have virtually no legitimate civilian use.
So no one's using this to make household products?
Yeah, not at all. We are talking about nerve agents like sarin, VX, or blister agents like sulfur mustard. If you are manufacturing Schedule 1 chemicals, you are almost certainly building a weapon.
Or what, maybe military lab testing gas masks?
Right. A state military laboratory might produce a tiny, strictly monitored amount to test their own protective gear, but that's it.
So Schedule 1 is just a massive red flag. You don't accidentally synthesize sarin gas while trying to make a new brand of shampoo.
Precisely. It doesn't happen by accident. But then you move to Schedule 2.
Okay, what's Schedule 2?
These are chemicals that can be used as precursors to make those horrific Schedule 1 weapons, but they also have legitimate, albeit small-scale, commercial uses.
Small scale.
Right. For example, a chemical called thiodeglycol.
Thiodeglycol. Got it.
It's a key ingredient in manufacturing mustard gas, but it is also used in the textile industry for dyeing fabrics.
Okay.
And it's used to make the ink in everyday ballpoint pens.
Oh, which brings us back to the ink plant scenario from the beginning.
Exactly. And it gets even broader with Schedule 3.
Let me guess, even more common.
Much more common. These are toxic chemicals or precursors that can be weaponized, like phosgene, which was used as a chemical weapon in World War I, but they are produced in massive industrial quantities globally for completely legitimate reasons.
Wait, phosgene is used today.
Oh, heavily. Phosgene is a crucial building block in the production of polyurethanes and plastics. Our modern world relies on Schedule 3 chemicals.
Wait, so a precursor is basically like flour or sugar in a cake recipe.
Okay, I like where you're going with this.
Like, by themselves, they are harmless pantry items, right? You use them every day to bake bread or make cookies. But if you mix them with the intent to bake a highly illegal, highly toxic cake, those innocent ingredients suddenly become legally classified as part of a weapon.
What's fascinating here is that your analogy perfectly illustrates why the law must be this granular. You cannot just arrest someone for having the final completed weapon.
Because by then it's too late.
Exactly. By then, the threat is imminent, and it might be too late to prevent a catastrophe. You have to be able to stop them when they are gathering the ingredients.
But to use my baking analogy, society cannot ban flour and sugar outright.
No, because legitimate bakeries, or in our real-world case, pharmaceutical companies, agricultural producers, plastics manufacturers, and research labs, they need them to function.
Right. The law protects industrial, agricultural, research, medical, and pharmaceutical purposes.
It has to.
So the legal trigger isn't just the existence of the chemical molecule on a table. It's the intent behind possessing it.
Yes.
Which the law infers heavily from the type and the quantity. So like if you have 10 liters of a specific Schedule 2 precursor and you run an ink manufacturing plant where that chemical is a known, documented additive, the authorities recognize that as consistent with a peaceful purpose.
That's completely fine. But if you have 10,000 liters of that exact same precursor
Oh, wow.
stored in an unmarked warehouse with no commercial output, no supply chain, and, say, reinforced ventilation systems,
Yeah, that's not for pens.
the context shifts entirely. The legal classification transforms, the flour becomes a weapon.
That dual-use dilemma is incredibly tense. I mean, you're constantly evaluating innocent chemicals based on context.
It's a constant balancing act.
Which naturally means if we are heavily regulating the ingredients, we also have to regulate the kitchens where they are cooked up.
Absolutely.
And the text dedicates an enormous amount of space to defining what a facility actually is. Reading through the categorization of industrial sites, it genuinely felt like I was opening up one of those Russian matryoshka dolls.
Oh, that's a perfect way to describe it.
Right, because there are layers inside of layers.
The nested structure of an industrial site is very deliberate in this law. It categorizes these sites into 3 distinct nested levels.
Okay, walk me through them.
Let's start at the most microscopic level and zoom out. At the core, you have the unit. This is the specific equipment, the reaction vessels, the specialized plumbing where the chemical reaction actually takes place.
Like the literal pot on the stove.
Yes, the pot. Then you step back 1 layer and you have the plant. The plant is the relatively self-contained area, structure, or building containing 1 or more of those units.
Okay, so the room or the building holding the pots.
Right. It includes the local control laboratory where they test the batches, the local first aid station, and the immediate storage areas.
Okay, makes sense. And then you step back to the outermost layer.
Macro level.
Right, which the law calls the plant site, or sometimes referred to as the works or the factory. This is the local integration of all the operations. And this is where the definitions get wildly expansive to me.
They cast a very wide net.
They really do. The plant site doesn't just include the laboratories. It explicitly includes administration and other offices. It includes repair and maintenance shops,
Yeah.
the central medical center,
The utilities.
the central effluent and waste treatment area, the warehouse storage. But, I mean, why does the law care about the administrative office or the repair shop?
Yeah.
They aren't mixing highly regulated Schedule 1 chemicals in the break room, right? If the crime is happening inside the reaction unit, why go out of your way to legally define the Human Resources Department's building as part of a potential chemical weapons facility?
Because weaponizing chemicals at scale is not a lone mad scientist in a basement holding a test tube.
It's not a comic book.
No, it is a massive, complex industrial endeavor, and industrial endeavors leave administrative and logistical footprints.
Ah, I see.
By legally encompassing the entire infrastructure within the definition of the plant site, the law ensures that national and international inspectors have jurisdiction over the entire life cycle of a chemical.
So they aren't just looking for the poison itself. They are looking for the shadow the poison casts on the rest of the business.
That's exactly it. An illicit weapons program might be incredibly careful about hiding what is happening inside the actual reaction unit.
They'd probably scrub it clean before inspectors even get there.
Yeah.
They absolutely would, but they still have to buy the precursor chemicals from a supplier. They still have to pay the technicians who run the machines.
The paper trail.
The administrative office holds the purchase orders, the shipping manifests, the employee payroll logs.
So the paper trail is practically part of the weapon.
Legally, yes. And look at the inclusion of the medical center.
That's interesting. Why the medical center?
Let's say a plant claims to be making standard agricultural fertilizer, but an inspector walks into the on-site medical center and finds a massive stockpile of atropine.
What's atropine?
It's an antidote for nerve agent poisoning.
Oh.
Yeah. And they find logs showing they are constantly treating workers for meiosis, which is the pinpointing of the pupils, a classic symptom of nerd agent exposure.
That is a massive red flag.
Huge. That discrepancy is a massive red flag. The medical records betray the lie being told in the laboratory.
And the waste treatment area. The law specifically includes the central effluent and waste treatment area.
Because effluents never lie.
Right. You might scrub your reaction vessels until they shine, but the chemical byproducts, the runoff, the trace elements, they have to go somewhere.
Exactly. By including the central waste treatment area in the legal definition of the facility, inspectors have the authority to test the water and the soil to see what is actually being synthesized upstream.
So a discrepancy in the wastewater might be the only clue that a legitimate plastics manufacturer is secretly running a side operation producing phosgene for illicit purposes.
It's often the very first clue.
That Matryoshka doll structure makes complete sense when you view it as an investigative net. The unit is where the crime happens, the plant is the physical shield around it, and the plant site is the logistical footprint.
Right.
And the law just says, we get to shine a light on all of it. So the logical next step in our deep dive is identifying who is actually holding the flashlight.
The enforcers.
Exactly. Who has the authority to enforce this massive surveillance net?
So the law designates a Philippine national authority on the Chemical Weapons Convention. And the entity chosen to wield this immense power is the Anti-Terrorism Council, or the ATC.
The ATC.
Right. The ATC Program Management Center acts as the secretariat, managing the day-to-day operations.
And their mandate is staggering. The text outlines that the ATC develops the rules and policies. They cause or direct the investigation of violations. They designate local inspectors. They establish a national registry of all these chemicals.
It's a huge portfolio.
It is. And they identify the local laboratories that will become OPCW designated laboratories. OPCW being the global organization for the prohibition of chemical weapons.
Correct.
But I mean, I have to push back on this designation for a second.
Go ahead.
If we're talking about toxic chemicals, industrial wastewater, manufacturing plant inspections, and molecular laboratory analysis, why hand all of this over to the Anti-Terrorism Council?
It seems a bit intense, right?
Yeah. Wouldn't this inherently be a job for the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, or maybe the Department of Health? Handing the regulation of chemistry over to a national security anti-terrorism body feels like a massive escalation.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the escalation is exactly the point.
How so?
Well, the Department of Health and the Department of Environment absolutely will be involved in the disposal and safety aspects, which we will cover in agonizing detail shortly. We have to remember the fundamental nature of what is being regulated here.
The weapons themselves.
Right. Chemical weapons are not environmental hazards. They are weapons of mass destruction.
Ah, It's the difference between an accidental oil spill and an engineered threat.
Precisely. If an oil tanker leaks, that is a tragedy, but it is a regulatory failure. If someone is synthesizing VX nerve gas, the ultimate end user of that product is almost always a hostile state actor or a terrorist organization.
Not just a careless factory owner.
No. The Anti-Terrorism Council has the intelligence gathering capacity, the high-level security clearances, and the cross-agency authority needed to track these kinds of threats.
So they can see the whole board, not just the test tubes.
Exactly. A health inspector might know how to read a chemical manifest and check for ventilation compliance, but the ATC knows how to track the illicit financing network funding the purchase of those chemicals.
That makes a lot of sense.
Furthermore, the ATC serves as the national focal point for the OPCW. They are dealing directly with international intelligence agencies.
The text also mandates that the ATC must periodically update the list of scheduled chemicals in Schedules 1, 2, and 3 upon the advice of the OPCW.
Right.
And they do this via formal resolutions published in the Official Gazette. So the law actually builds in a mechanism to evolve.
Which is vital.
Yeah, as bad actors invent new toxic chemicals, the ATC can legally add them to the prohibited list without having to pass a brand new law through the entire legislative branch every single time.
It creates a responsive, living, legal framework. I mean, the speed of legislative action rarely matches the speed of scientific innovation.
Usually it's years behind.
Decades, sometimes. So by empowering the ATC to update the schedules via resolution, the legal net can adapt to new chemical threats almost in real time.
Which is terrifying but necessary. But an authority as powerful as the ATC still needs clear boundaries to enforce, right?
Yeah.
They need to know exactly what the hard lines are.
Oh, and those lines are drawn in thick black ink.
I'll say, the prohibitions are exhaustive. It is illegal to develop, produce, acquire, stockpile, retain, or use a chemical weapon. It is illegal to transfer them domestically or across borders.
Yeah.
But here's the one that really stood out to me regarding the scope of the policing.
Which one?
It is strictly illegal to finance these activities.
Yes, that is a crucial inclusion.
Targets the enablers, right?
Exactly. You don't just prosecute the chemist in the lab wearing the hazmat suit. You prosecute the venture capitalist, the shell company, or the shadow bank that provided the funding. The financier is treated with the exact same legal severity as the person turning the valves on the production unit.
That's intense.
It acknowledges that weapons of mass destruction require capital. Choke off the capital, and the chemistry stops.
The law also bans assisting, encouraging, or inducing anyone to engage in prohibited activities. And you cannot import or export the most dangerous substances, Schedule 1 chemicals, to or from a state that is not a party to the convention.
Not even a drop.
You cannot even transit them through a non-state party. It's like putting a total global quarantine on these substances.
That's exactly what it is.
But within these very hard lines, there's a fascinating gray area that the law has to navigate carefully. And that revolves around riot control agents.
Ah, yes, a tear gas dilemma.
Let's rewind for a second to the definitions. The text defines a riot control agent as any chemical not listed as a scheduled chemical which can rapidly produce sensory irritation or disabling physical effects in humans that disappear within a short time following termination of exposure.
Right, so we are talking about tear gas, pepper spray, mace.
Chemicals designed to incapacitate temporarily without lasting harm.
Exactly.
But then, in the prohibitions, the law explicitly states it is prohibited to use a riot control agent as a method of warfare.
Yes.
And right after that, there is this highly specific caveat regarding the Armed Forces of the Philippines, the AFP.
This is where it gets complicated.
It says nothing in the Act prohibits the AFP from using non-lethal or lethal weapons other than those prohibited in the Act in the conduct of combat operations for the suppression of insurgency and other serious threats to national security.
It is a profound legal distinction, and it highlights the delicate difference between international warfare and domestic security.
That completely flips my understanding of military rules of engagement. Because if we apply that to the tear gas definition, to the person getting tear gassed, the chemical feels exactly the same.
The physiological response is identical, yes.
Right. So why is deploying tear gas a war crime in one context, but legally protected in another?
It comes down to the psychology and the escalation of conflict on a global scale.
Okay, unpack that for me.
In an international armed conflict, a war between nations, the use of any chemical on the battlefield, even a non-lethal riot control agent, is universally banned.
Really? Any chemical?
Any chemical. The fear is that in the fog of war, if one side suddenly deploys a massive cloud of gas into a trench or across a front line, the opposing army isn't going to politely wait to find out if it's just tear gas or if it's deadly sarin gas.
Oh, wow.
Right. Their chemical alarms will trigger, panic will set in, and they will assume the absolute worst.
And the response will be devastating.
Exactly. They will retaliate with their own lethal chemical weapons. The use of a non-lethal agent could instantly trigger an escalating, unstoppable cycle of chemical warfare.
I see. So the ban on tear gas in warfare isn't necessarily because tear gas itself is a weapon of mass destruction.
No, not at all.
It's because using it shatters the psychological and tactical barrier that prevents actual weapons of mass destruction from being unleashed. It's basically a tripwire for global annihilation.
That is a perfect way to put it. It's an escalation tripwire. But in a domestic law enforcement or internal security context?
Like a riot.
Right, like suppressing an armed insurgency or managing a violent civilian riot within your own borders. That risk of nation-state escalation isn't present.
The insurgents aren't going to respond with a tactical nuclear or chemical strike.
Exactly. The state must comply with international treaties banning chemical warfare globally, while simultaneously preserving its military and police forces' legal right to conduct internal security operations.
Using conventional, legally permitted, non-lethal methods to minimize casualties.
Exactly. It is a very precise legal fence separating global warfare from internal state security.
A fence separating a riot from World War III.
Basically, yeah.
And if someone crosses that fence, if they violate these prohibitions, the consequences laid out are catastrophic. I mean, the penalties are absolutely draconian. The Anti-Terrorism Council surveillance net has teeth, and the bite is lethal.
As it should be, given the nature of the crime. Let's look at the breakdown.
Let's do it.
If any person develops, produces, acquires, stockpiles, or uses chemical weapons, the penalty is life imprisonment.
And it explicitly says without the benefit of parole. And it even blocks the provisions of Republic Act number 10592, which is the law that usually grants good conduct time allowance.
So no time off for good behavior.
No. You cannot be a model prisoner, read books, teach a class in the prison yard, and get out early. You die in prison. Plus, there's a fine ranging from 2 to 5 million pesos.
And remember the financiers we discussed.
Oh, right, the money people.
If you finance the development or use of chemical weapons, you are looking at 20 years to life imprisonment, plus a fine of up to 1 million pesos.
So the banker gets the same cell block as the bomb maker.
Pretty much. And if you produce the most dangerous Schedule I chemicals without authorization, even if you haven't weaponized them yet, that is 12 to 20 years.
Just for making the precursor.
Just for making it. Even just obstructing or deceiving a national or international inspector carries a penalty of 6 to 12 years behind bars.
The text also hands down what is essentially the corporate death penalty.
Yes, the juridical entity clause.
Right. If a partnership, corporation, or juridical entity is found guilty, their registration and license to operate with the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Department of Trade and Industry is permanently canceled and revoked. The company simply ceases to exist.
And we have to ask why the law goes to that extreme.
Right. Why not just arrest the corrupt CEO and let the company continue operating under new management?
Because an organization capable of manufacturing weapons of mass destruction has a corrupted supply chain, compromised facilities, and a culture of deep secrecy. You cannot just excise the tumor.
You have to burn the entire corporate structure to the ground.
Exactly, to ensure those illicit supply lines are permanently severed. And the personal liability for corporate officers is also baked into the law.
Oh yeah, they can't hide.
The president, director, manager, or trustee who consents to, knowingly tolerates, or even just due to gross negligence, fails to prevent the violation, they are held criminally liable.
You cannot hide behind the corporate veil or claim ignorance when your factory is churning out nerve agents.
You really can't.
The law also outlines specific punishments depending on your status. If you are a government official found guilty, you suffer absolute perpetual disqualification from holding any public office, plus the maximum penalty.
You're done in politics forever.
Forever. If you are a foreigner found guilty, You serve your full sentence in the Philippines, and then you are immediately deported without further proceedings and permanently barred from ever re-entering the country.
It's extremely thorough.
But here's where it gets really interesting. And honestly, this is the part of the text that absolutely blew my mind.
The extraterritoriality.
The extraterritorial application, yes.
The long arm of the law.
The provisions of this act apply to all persons within or outside the Philippines.
Right.
If a prohibited act is committed by a citizen of the Philippines anywhere in the world, or against a Philippine citizen, or against Philippine property globally, or by a corporation controlled by a Philippine citizen, the law applies.
It follows you.
So, imagine a hypothetical scenario. You are a citizen of the Philippines. You decide you want to get into the lucrative, horrific business of chemical weapons.
Not a great career choice.
No, but you fly to a remote island in a country that hasn't signed these treaties. You set up a lab completely outside Philippine jurisdiction. You build a chemical weapon there, and you think you are untouchable.
You think you're safe.
Right. But the law says otherwise. The law follows you across the globe.
This is the absolute hallmark of international treaty compliance. The Chemical Weapons Convention is designed to cast an inescapable net over the entire planet.
Because if there's one safe haven, the whole thing falls apart.
Exactly. To eradicate chemical weapons globally, nations must ensure their citizens cannot find safe havens or jurisdictional loopholes to conduct banned research.
Right.
By enacting this extraterritorial clause, the Philippines is essentially telling the world, we take responsibility for our citizens and our corporations, no matter where they are standing on the map. If the Philippine government discovers you are running that island lab, they will work with Interpol, they will coordinate with foreign governments, they will secure extradition, and they will bring you back to face life imprisonment.
It's an inescapable legal net. But let's say the net works perfectly. The intelligence comes in, the authorities coordinate a raid on a facility, they bypass the administrative offices, they breach the production unit, and they actually find an illicit chemical weapon.
Okay, the nightmare scenario.
Right. The bad guys are arrested and are facing life without parole. Justice is served. But now you have a massive new problem sitting right in front of you.
The physical reality of the weapon itself.
Exactly. You cannot just take a barrel of nerve agent and throw it in the municipal trash. You cannot put it in an evidence locker at the local police precinct.
No, absolutely not.
The custodial and destruction process sounds like an absolute logistical nightmare.
It is a highly choreographed, incredibly dangerous sequence of events, and every single second counts.
Walk us through it. What happens the moment they find it?
The moment a chemical weapon is discovered, the priority shifts instantly from law enforcement to containment. The Bureau of Fire Protection, the BFP, is immediately called in.
The fire department.
Yes. They exert all efforts to contain the effects of the weapon and protect the immediate vicinity.
So the fire department is the first line of defense against a localized chemical disaster.
They are setting up the perimeter, preparing decontamination tents, ensuring no vapors are escaping the building.
And
Then, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, the AFP, takes physical custody of the weapon. But the text mandates this incredibly tense procedural requirement.
what's the requirement?
The apprehending team has to physically conduct an inventory and photograph the weapons right there on the spot, and they have to do it in the presence of the accused, the person they just arrested, and a representative of the ATC.
Think about the tension of that specific moment.
It's terrifying.
You are standing inside an illicit laboratory. You have a highly volatile, highly toxic substance in front of you that could kill everyone in a 10-block radius if a seal breaks. You have a suspect in handcuffs who might be uncooperative. And before you can move that weapon to a safe bunker, you have to meticulously document it, photograph it, count the vials, and have the accused and the ATC rep sign the inventory copies.
It ensures an unbreakable chain of custody for the eventual trial, but it is fraught with extreme physical danger.
And then a clock starts ticking.
Right.
A relentless 24-hour clock.
Yes. Within 24 hours of confiscation, the AFP must submit samples for confirmatory testing to an OPCW designated laboratory.
This sounds like a cross between a highly volatile bomb squad operation and a forensic crime scene. You have 24 hours to secure a sample of a completely unknown, potentially lethal compound, transport it securely through a populated area, and get it to an internationally recognized lab.
All while ensuring this highly toxic material doesn't leak and wipe out the local environment.
Which brings us to the ultimate challenge, destruction.
The hardest part.
Once the lab confirms what the substance is and the court officially orders its destruction, the process is incredibly strict. You mentioned earlier that you can't just throw it in the trash.
You really can't.
The law explicitly prohibits the easy ways out. It states that open pit burning, land burial, or dumping of chemical weapons in any body of water are strictly prohibited.
And I imagine we can deduce why those traditional disposal methods are banned, right? It's about preventing an environmental catastrophe that outlasts the weapon itself.
Oh, absolutely. If you incinerate a nerve agent in an open pit, you haven't destroyed the weapon, you've just aerosolized it.
You've essentially created a massive toxic cloud that will drift over the city.
Right. You bury it in the ground, the metal casing eventually corrodes, the agent leaches into the soil, and it poisons the groundwater supply for generations.
And if you dump it in the ocean, you destroy marine ecosystems, and eventually a highly toxic barrel washes up on a public beach.
Exactly the problem.
Yeah.
So how does a government safely dispose of something designed to be indestructible and lethal?
This is where the interagency coordination we discussed earlier becomes paramount. The Anti-Terrorism Council, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, the Department of Science and Technology, and the Department of Health all have to coordinate.
They all have to agree on a plan.
Yes. They have to design a bespoke destruction procedure that complies with stringent national and international safety and emissions regulations, and representatives from the OPCW have to witness it.
Wait, they have to physically be there.
They have to physically watch the weapon be neutralized.
But how do they actually do it if they can't burn it or bury it?
It usually involves highly specialized, closed-system incineration facilities.
Okay.
We are talking about furnaces that operate at thousands of degrees with massive multi-stage filtration scrubbers that capture every single toxic molecule before the exhaust is released.
So it's burning, but hyper-controlled.
Very controlled. Or they use chemical neutralization processes where they introduce other chemicals to break down the nerve agent into less toxic, manageable industrial waste. Building these specialized destruction facilities can cost millions, sometimes billions of dollars.
Billions. And I noticed a tiny little sentence in the text that feels like a massive gut punch to the violators regarding that cost.
Oh, about who pays for it.
Yeah. It says, the cost of destruction and disposal of any chemical weapon shall be borne by the erring person.
The state is not going to foot the bill for safely neutralizing the nightmare you created.
I love that. Once convicted, the entirety of your corporate and personal assets can be seized to pay for the safe disposal of the weapon.
It is staggering to think about the logistics involved in just making one barrel of chemicals disappear safely.
Just one barrel.
Right. But this domestic coordination, the police raids, the fire department containment, the military custody, the scientific destruction, that is only half the battle.
What's the other half?
Because the Philippines didn't just write this law for itself, it wrote it to comply with the Chemical Weapons Convention.
Huh.
And that means the final piece of the puzzle is how the country proves to the rest of the world that they are actually following the rules.
We are talking about the global panopticon, the bureaucracy of compliance.
Exactly.
The text details that the ATC has to prepare and submit annual declarations to the OPCW. So anyone handling these scheduled chemicals, like the legitimate businesses, the pharmaceutical labs, the agricultural producers we talked about earlier, they must notify the ATC.
They have to keep incredibly rigid records.
Yeah, and submit annual reports detailing exactly what they bought, what they used, and what they have left over.
And then the international inspectors arrive.
The OPCW inspection teams.
Right. The ATC issues them certificates, granting them the authority to conduct routine and challenge inspections, verifying the accuracy of all those declarations.
The text says these international inspectors must be accompanied by a local authorized representative from the ATC. But the access they get is sweeping.
It's almost limitless.
They can examine records, take samples for analysis for the reaction units, and interview personnel inside the facility. But this is where I really try to put myself in the shoes of a civilian business owner.
It would be incredibly stressful.
If I am running a legitimate, highly successful pharmaceutical company, I would be terrified. Let's say I have spent $1 billion in 10 years researching a new, groundbreaking, life-saving drug.
Okay.
And suddenly, an international team of inspectors walks in, demands access to my central analytical laboratory, starts taking samples of my proprietary compounds, and reading my internal research records.
It's a huge risk for IP.
Exactly. How does a company protect its trade secrets or its proprietary formulas while still complying with these incredibly invasive, globally mandated inspections?
This raises an important question, and it represents perhaps the most delicate balance in the entire law.
How do they handle it?
How do you mandate absolute global transparency without destroying the intellectual property that drives legitimate scientific advancement? The text addresses this through the Protection of Confidential Information Clause.
Okay, what does that entail?
It recognizes that legitimate businesses have a fundamental right to their intellectual property. The law mandates that strict non-disclosure agreements must be entered into by the parties involved before an inspection begins.
But, I mean, does a standard NDA really hold up against the weight of an international treaty inspection? If an inspector finds a new chemical structure that cures a disease, what stops them from taking that knowledge back to their home country?
The law strictly limits how that information can be used, both legally and practically.
How so?
It states that confidential information given or obtained pursuant to this act shall be disclosed only for 3 highly specific reasons.
Which are?
For the purpose of complying with obligations under the Convention, for enforcing this act domestically, or for dealing with an immediate public safety emergency.
So no casual sharing.
None. It cannot be sold, it cannot be leaked to corporate competitors, and it cannot be used for unrelated regulatory fishing expeditions.
Okay, that makes me feel a bit better.
And the OPCW itself has incredibly rigorous internal firewalls to protect the data they gather. It is a delicate dance between maintaining total transparency for the sake of global security and protecting the intellectual property of innocent businesses.
And the cooperation doesn't stop at the borders either.
Yeah.
The law authorizes the ATC to collaborate with other state authorities and international organizations.
It's a global network.
Yeah, they can share intelligence data about who is buying and selling these chemicals globally, who is brokering the technology, and which shell companies are moving the money. It is an entire global intelligence network built purely to track the movement of molecules.
Furthermore, the law mandates the building of local capacity.
What do you mean?
The ATC has to support the establishment of confirmatory laboratories and destruction facilities in-country, fostering collaborations with the private sector to ensure rapid incident response.
Oh, I see.
It is the building of a permanent scientific immune system against chemical threats, ensuring the nation doesn't have to rely entirely on outside help if a crisis occurs.
That's fascinating. So we have covered an immense amount of ground today.
We really have.
We started by looking at the absolute declaration of a chemical weapons-free state. We explored the microscopic molecular definition of what a chemical precursor is and the dual-use dilemma of regulating chemicals that can bake a cake or build a bomb.
The Matryoshka dolls.
Yes, we navigated the Matryoshka doll structure of industrial facilities, realizing that the administrative paper trail is just as important as the laboratory test tube. We unpacked the sweeping, terrifying powers of the Anti-Terrorism Council,
The extraterritorial reach.
the absolute global legal reach of extraterritorial jurisdiction, and the corporate death penalty. We walked through the tense 24-hour ticking clock of seizing a volatile weapon, the environmental science of safely destroying it without poisoning the earth, and finally the international inspections and delicate IP protections that keep the entire global system honest.
It is a monumental, incredibly complex legal and scientific architecture.
It really is. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? I think it is a profound realization of just how much invisible, legal, scientific, and bureaucratic infrastructure exists around us every single day.
It's hidden in plain sight.
There is an entire world operating quietly in the background, analyzing supply chains, testing wastewater, and tracking molecules purely to keep the worst inventions of humanity at bay. There are people whose entire careers are dedicated to ensuring that the line between a civilian factory and a catastrophic weapon remains firmly intact.
And if we look forward, that line is only going to become harder to defend.
Yeah, why is that?
Well, the entire architecture of this law, the schedules of chemicals, the specific definitions of precursors, the laboratory testing protocols, it is all built on the chemistry we already know exists.
Right, it's reactionary in a way.
It is built on historical data.
Yeah.
But we are now entering an era where artificial intelligence and machine learning can synthesize and model thousands of novel, highly toxic chemical compounds in a matter of hours.
Oh, wow.
Algorithms can design poisons that have never existed in nature, compounds that are completely absent from Schedule 1, 2, or 3.
So they wouldn't even be on the list.
Exactly. What happens tomorrow when a completely new, totally undocumented, toxic chemical is generated in a digital simulation and printed in a decentralized lab? Does a rigid, meticulously categorized law like this move fast enough to catch an entirely new branch of lethal chemistry before it is too late?
That is a chilling thought. We started this deep dive talking about invisible fences in the murky waters of molecular legislation. This law proves that humanity has built a massive, globally enforced fence to contain the threats of the 20th and early 21st centuries.
But the threats are evolving.
But as the chemistry gets faster and the intelligence gets artificial, we have to wonder if the monsters of tomorrow will simply walk right through it, unseen by the tripwires we spent decades laying down. Keep questioning those hidden systems, keep looking at the laws that shape our world, and, as always, keep diving deep.
Welcome to the debate. Imagine trying to draw a precise, a geometric line in the sand and expecting a cloud of toxic gas to respect that boundary.
Right. Good luck with that.
Yeah, exactly. When we talk about legislating and regulating chemical agents, we are dealing with a threat that is inherently formless. It is prone to drifting, not just across physical borders, but across our carefully constructed legal definitions.
It really is. It resists containment entirely.
Today, we are analyzing Republic Act No. 12174. That is the Philippine Chemical Weapons Prohibition Act, enacted on April 15, 2025. We are looking strictly at the text of this legislation to answer a central question.
Yeah, the big one. Does this law successfully create an airtight prohibition against chemical weapons? Or do its exemptions for domestic counterinsurgency blur the line into chemical warfare?
Right. I will be arguing that the Act is a masterclass in definitional precision that successfully balances absolute international prohibition with practical domestic security.
While I will argue that authorizing the military to use chemical riot control agents in domestic combat operations creates a dangerous, exploitable loophole that undermines the spirit of the treaty.
So to start us off, I really believe the legislation succeeds because of how it separates the science from the tactic. I mean, if you look at the baseline of the Act, it unequivocally bans the development and use of chemical weapons under any circumstance.
Sure, on paper.
Well, it establishes absolute compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention, but it doesn't ignore reality, you know? It manages the incredibly complex dual-use nature of chemicals by drawing a sharp biological line.
A line between what exactly?
Between what it categorizes as toxic chemicals and what it calls riot control agents. It recognizes that allowing the armed forces of the Philippines to use non-lethal sensory irritants to suppress a domestic insurgency isn't a loophole.
I would argue it is.
But it's a humanitarian necessity. It provides a highly regulated alternative to deadly force, all while strictly forbidding their use as a method of warfare.
Yeah, but this is where the text introduces a severe intellectual contradiction. The edge cases created by these provisions are deeply concerning.
How so?
The text explicitly prohibits riot control agents as a method of warfare, yet in the exact same breath, the legislation explicitly permits the armed forces to use these exact same chemicals in combat operations against insurgents.
Right, domestic insurgents.
But we have to question the coherence of classifying a military firefight against domestic insurgents as fundamentally different from warfare. To me, this exemption provides a massive avenue for the state to use chemical agents in armed conflict.
I don't see it as a massive avenue.
It relies almost entirely on how the government chooses to label the people they are shooting at. I mean, if it's a foreign soldier, it's a war crime. If it's a domestic insurgent, it's just public order.
I think we need to look closer at the actual mechanisms of the chemicals the law is separating here. Because that distinction isn't just a semantic trick. It's grounded in physiological reality.
Physiological reality doesn't change the tactical application, though.
It does, though. The brilliance of the legislation isn't just in its definitions. It's how it physically separates chemicals based on how long they last in the human body. The law draws a line between a Schedule 1 chemical,
like sarin.
Exactly. Let's say a nerve agent like sarin, which irreversibly inhibits the enzymes your muscles use to relax, causing total respiratory failure and death within minutes.
Right.
And it separates that from a riot control agent, where the physical effects, the tearing up and the coughing, they just vanish minutes after the exposure ends.
Yes, they vanish. Eventually.
The law permits riot control agents exactly because the physiological mechanism is non-lethal. It is meant for situations where using it is more appropriate than using deadly force.
Hold on. The temporary nature of a chemical's physiological effect is completely irrelevant if that temporary blindness is used to set up a lethal strike.
A lethal strike?
Yes, and this is what the phrase combat operations actually means on the ground. Let's look at the tactical reality of a counterinsurgency operation. You have a military unit engaged in an urban firefight.
Okay.
They use tear gas or another sensory irritant to flush insurgents out of a fortified barricade. The insurgents stumble out, they are temporarily blinded, they are choking,
And they surrender?
or they walk directly into a field of fire from infantry rifles. The chemical itself isn't the lethal agent, no, but it is the primary tactical mechanism that enabled the lethal strike.
But employing a sensory irritant to flush out a barricaded terror cell, specifically to avoid a prolonged lethal crossfire in a civilian area, is fundamentally different from indiscriminately deploying mustard gas across a battlefield.
Different how? The result is the same.
The intent is different, the scale is different, and the biological permanence is different. You aren't wiping out a sovereign nation's battalion.
Are you sure? You were taking the exact same chemical, dropping it from military hardware in the exact same tactical manner to gain an operational advantage over an armed adversary.
But again, it's about the scale of the threat.
In the chaos of a firefight, a soldier isn't deploying tear gas to peacefully place someone in handcuffs. They're deploying it to outmaneuver or neutralize a target. That is the fundamental essence of warfare strategy.
But the legislation strictly regulates this.
When the law allows this under the umbrella of suppression of insurgency, it erodes the normative taboo against using chemicals in combat. It basically argues that an action isn't warfare simply because of the domestic zip code of the target.
I disagree. The legislation explicitly enforces the boundary against actual chemical weapons with an incredibly heavy hand to prevent that exact slippery slope.
A heavy hand?
Yes, the act mandates life imprisonment without parole for the actual weaponization of scheduled toxic chemicals. It doesn't create a slippery slope, it builds a massive concrete wall between temporary irritants and permanent biological harm.
But because that operational line between a combat operation and warfare is so incredibly blurry on the ground, it creates a massive practical problem. Who actually gets to make that call in real time?
Well, the authorities.
Right, but if the military is the one using the gas, how are they policed? And that brings us directly to the oversight architecture of this legislation, which takes a deeply problematic turn.
Ah, you're referring to the designation of the national authority.
Exactly. The law designates the Anti-Terrorism Council, the ATC, as the sole national authority, and they act as the focal point for the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW.
Which makes complete sense.
Does it? Think about what that actually means in practice. The International Chemical Weapons Convention requires rigorous, objective scientific data collection, random facility inspections, and neutral chemical analysis.
Right.
But this legislation hands the collection of scheduled chemical data, the facility inspections, and the initiation of chemical forfeiture entirely to the Anti-Terrorism Council.
Which, again, makes sense given the threat level of the materials involved.
It makes sense for neutralization, but not for treaty verification. By handing all of this to an anti-terrorism body rather than a civilian, scientific, public health, or environmental agency, the act inherently militarizes the treaty's implementation.
I wouldn't say it militarizes it.
It removes objective scientific oversight. It places it within a national security apparatus whose primary lens is threat elimination, not scientific neutrality. It's the equivalent of asking a SWAT team to run a public health lab.
That's a bit of an exaggeration.
Their priority is neutralizing an immediate threat, not preserving a pristine control sample for an international diplomatic tribunal.
Wait, I have to stop you there because you're looking at the ATC's designation in a total vacuum. You're completely ignoring the mandatory interagency architecture that is physically written into the text.
I'm not ignoring it,
The law does not give the Anti-Terrorism Council a blank check or unchecked unilateral scientific power. It specifically forces the ATC to coordinate with the Bureau of Fire Protection to spearhead these inspections.
Coordinate with, sure.
Furthermore, the procedures for destroying these weapons must be established in coordination with the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, the Department of Science and Technology, and the Department of Health. The scientific and environmental experts are structurally baked into the operational mechanism.
But being coordinated with is fundamentally different from holding the ultimate regulatory authority.
The ATC holds the pen. They are the focal point, yes.
The legislation explicitly states that no inspection of a facility shall take place without the authorization of the ATC. That is a massive bottleneck. That gives an Intelligence and Security Council the power to act as an absolute gatekeeper for international scientific inspectors.
But consider the practical reality of what we are dealing with. We aren't talking about checking a factory for excessive carbon emissions or industrial runoff here.
Obviously.
We are talking about Schedule 1 chemicals, weapons of mass destruction. Unauthorized possession carries up to 20 years in prison and millions of pesos in fines. Given those stakes, shouldn't the central coordinating node be an agency inherently equipped to handle severe, immediate national security threats?
I mean, yes, but
If a clandestine nerve agent laboratory is discovered in a densely populated area, you need an agency that can instantaneously mobilize military, police, and intelligence assets. A civilian environmental agency simply does not have the operational capacity, the intelligence network, or the security clearance to manage a raid on a chemical weapons facility.
look, I don't disagree that securing a hostile facility requires a heavy security apparatus. Of course it does.
Right.
But acting as the national focal point for an international disarmament treaty requires transparency and diplomatic trust. When the primary liaison to international OPCW inspectors is an Anti-Terrorism Council, you introduce an inherent structural tension.
Tension is unavoidable with chemical weapons.
But an intelligence agency's entire mandate is secrecy, compartmentalization, and operational security. A treaty verification mandate relies on absolute transparency. Under the law, the ATC is also bound to protect confidential information.
As they should be.
But who arbitrates what is a legitimate treaty secret versus a national security cover-up when the ATC controls the access of foreign inspectors?
That tension exists, sure. But the law creates a secure conduit for transparency rather than an unchecked open door that could compromise active domestic terror investigations.
A secure conduit controlled by spies?
The legislation explicitly mandates that the ATC shall issue certificates to OPCW inspection teams. It directs any proper person to provide inspectors with access to the facility, examine records, and take samples. The ATC isn't legally mandated to block them. It is legally mandated to facilitate them safely.
I understand the intention, but when the gatekeeper's primary paradigm is counterterrorism, transparency usually takes a backseat to security.
Well, let's look at what happens when transparency does occur and a threat is actually verified. Because once a chemical weapon is discovered and secured by this apparatus, the legislation outlines incredibly rigorous protocols for what happens next.
The actual physical destruction of the agents.
Exactly. And this is where the law's interaction with the physical environment becomes paramount.
It does, and I want to heavily scrutinize the logistics detailed in those destruction provisions, because on paper, it sounds robust.
It is robust.
I certainly applaud the absolute ban on open pit burning and the dumping of chemical weapons into bodies of water. That is a crucial, non-negotiable environmental safeguard.
Absolutely.
But the text dictates a massive practical vulnerability regarding the physical reality of how these dangerous materials are neutralized. It explicitly states that the cost of destruction and disposal shall be borne by the erring person.
Yeah, I'll admit, when I first read that provision stating the cost shall be borne by the erring person, I was a little confused.
It's baffling.
Because if you raid a destitute lone wolf terror cell, they obviously don't have millions of pesos to hire a specialized hazmat disposal team.
But if you look deeper at the surrounding text, the state is fully mobilized.
But relying on the perpetrator to pay is an enormous vulnerability. Liability is fine in civil disputes, but we are talking about highly volatile, incredibly dangerous chemical warfare agents.
Yes, but the state acts first. Let me break down what chemical destruction actually requires. You don't just pour bleach on a barrel of sulfur mustard. It requires highly specialized mobile destruction units, extreme thermal incineration, and complex chemical scrubbers for the toxic exhaust.
Right, it's very specialized.
It is obscenely expensive. The text places the financial burden of this highly specialized destruction on the erring person. If that person is a financially destitute insurgent group, or perhaps they were killed in the raid, Who pays for the immediate containment?
The state does.
But relying on punitive financial liability leaves a dangerous gap in emergency funding. These chemicals do not wait for a court order to garnish wages. They degrade, they leak, and they pose an imminent compounding threat to the public.
I see the vulnerability you are pointing out, but you are reading the liability clause as a prerequisite for action, which the broader text simply does not support.
It says, shall be borne.
Yes, but the state does not wait for a check to clear before neutralizing a chemical threat. The legislation explicitly mandates that the Bureau of Fire Protection shall exert all efforts in containing the effects immediately upon discovery.
Containing, yes, not destroying.
Furthermore, the law explicitly appropriates state funds for the implementation of the Act through the General Appropriations Act. The initial funding for the government to act is already there.
But those general appropriations cover the administrative implementation of the Act. You know, the day-to-day operations of the ATC, the registries, the paperwork.
They cover implementation.
But the specific provision regarding destruction carves out the physical cost of disposal and dumps it squarely on the perpetrator.
I read the phrase shall be borne by the erring person as a mechanism for the state to aggressively recoup costs post-destruction. It is a punitive liability measure.
I'm not so sure. Look at the procedural flow. The armed forces are mandated to conduct the transportation, storage, and destruction under stringent security measures. The procedure is established with the environmental and health department. The entire infrastructure of the state is mobilized by law.
Mobilized, yes, but funded?
The financial clause ensures that if corporate entities, well-funded syndicates, or state-sponsored actors attempt to produce these weapons, the Philippine government can legally strip their assets to pay for the massive cleanup operation. It is a powerful deterrent, not a bureaucratic hurdle to an emergency response. If it is merely a mechanism to recoup costs, the legislation should explicitly state that the government shall fund the destruction upfront and subsequently recover costs from the erring party. Words in a statute matter immensely.
They do, but context matters too.
By phrasing it as the cost of destruction and disposal shall be borne by the erring person, it creates statutory ambiguity. And in government bureaucracy, if an agency isn't explicitly and undeniably funded for a specific, highly expensive action, that action stalls.
I don't think it stalls when dealing with nerve gas.
If the Department of Environment or the Armed Forces has to eat the cost of a multi-million peso chemical disposal out of their standard, already stretched operating budget because the perpetrator is broke, you will inevitably see corners cut.
That's a cynical view of the agencies.
It's a realistic view of budgets. And when you cut corners disposing of Schedule I chemical weapons, the environmental and public health consequences are catastrophic. The intention might be punitive, but the wording risks operational paralysis.
But the sheer weight of the penalties provides the judicial mechanism to extract those costs. We are talking about fines ranging from 2 million to 5 million pesos for development and use, on top of life imprisonment. The law is designed to completely dismantle the operational and financial apparatus of anyone who touches chemical weapons.
Assuming there is a financial apparatus to dismantle. But, well, if we pull back and look at the whole picture, this really highlights the immense difficulty of taking pristine international treaties and operationalizing them into messy domestic law.
It certainly does. We're looking at a deeply structured framework that has to address an almost impossible spectrum of threats.
Right.
From my perspective, Republic Act number 12174 is a highly scientific, pragmatic piece of legislation. It rigorously fulfills international obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention while realistically managing severe domestic security threats.
If you interpret the definitions generously, maybe.
Well, the strict biological delineations it makes between toxic chemicals and temporary riot control agents, the uncompromising penalties it imposes, and the interagency structure it mandates represent a precise approach to a terrifyingly complex reality.
And I see the practical reality where human error, tactical chaos, and bureaucratic friction test those precise definitions.
Which is inevitable with any law.
True, but while the text has incredibly strong points, particularly the environmental parameters and the penal frameworks, the exemptions granted for military combat operations in domestic settings create a dangerous definitional gray area.
I still maintain the physiological difference protects that boundary.
But by attempting to define a chemical agent's legality based on whether the military is shooting at a foreign army or a domestic insurgent, the legislation risks violating the underlying spirit of the absolute prohibition it claims to uphold. And the militarization of oversight only compounds that risk by favoring secrecy over transparency.
I think one area where there is absolutely no gray area between us is the profound severity of the penalties outlined in the text.
Oh, absolutely.
The imposition of life imprisonment without the benefit of parole, the explicit denial of probation, and the immediate deportation of foreign offenders leaves no doubt about the state's baseline zero-tolerance policy for the actual weaponization of scheduled chemicals.
Yes, we definitely converge there. And we also agree on the strict environmental parameters placed on the destruction of these agents.
Right, the bans on improper disposal.
Exactly. Even if we fiercely debate the funding mechanisms and bureaucratic vulnerabilities behind them, the explicit, scientifically sound bans on open-pit burning and water dumping are vital for public safety.
Ultimately, this legislation forces us to confront the inherent complexity of drafting laws that must simultaneously govern microscopic chemical mechanisms, real-world domestic law enforcement tactics, and international rules of war.
It's a heavy burden for one piece of text.
It is a stark reminder that legal definitions of terms like combat and insurgency fundamentally shape how international treaties are applied in the mud and the fog of reality.
It proves that the line between a prohibited weapon of mass destruction and a permitted tool of public order is often thinner and vastly more subjective than any of us would like to admit. I highly suggest our listeners delve deeper into the text of this act to consider how these legal boundaries operate not just in a courtroom, but in the chaos of the real world.
Which brings us back to where we started. You can try to draw a precise, geometric line in the sand, but when the smoke clears, or rather, when the smoke refuses to clear, we are left to ask, does the law actually contain the danger, or does it merely give us a comforting way to categorize it?